Welcome. Really nice to see all of you. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Christine Harold. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Communication, and it is my great pleasure to introduce today's colloquium speaker, Professor Deborah Hawhee. Dr. Hawhee is McCourtney Professor of Civic Deliberation at Penn State University, where she studies and teaches rhetoric. Dr. Hawhee is author of 4 books, each innovatively told histories of rhetorical theory that draw out rhetoric's other than rational dimensions: feeling, body, sensation, and imagination. Her book, Rhetoric in Tooth and Claw, Animals, Language, Sensation, received the Rhetoric Society of America's Book Award in 2018. Her book, Moving Bodies, Kenneth Burke at the Edge of Language, received the 2010 Diamond Anniversary Book Award from NCA, and her first book, Bodily Arts, Rhetoric and Athletics in Ancient Greece, supported by a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, continues to influence our field's understanding of the mutually constitutive arts of rhetoric and athletics. She is co-author with Sharon Crowley of Ancient Rhetorics for Contemporary Students. A little more. Dr. Hawhee was named a fellow of the Rhetoric Society of America. Her research has been recognized with a Douglas W. Eininger Distinguished Rhetorical Scholar Award and a Distinguished Scholar Award from the Rhetorical and Communication Theory Division at NCA. So although it boggles my mind to say this, I first met Debbie 27 years ago when we were both graduate students studying rhetoric, Debbie in English and myself in communication at Penn State. For me, Debbie has always personified the dual character of the scholarly life, as she seems to master the fine art of balancing both the mind and the body, the classic and the modern, the rational and the emotional. She is a formidable intellect, but also wickedly funny and incredibly generous with her colleagues and her students. I've admired her as a scholar and as a person for many years, as I know many of us have. I'm honored to be a student of rhetoric in the age of Hawhee. For her stamp on the field is indelible, to say the least. Dr. Hawhee recently published her 4th book, A Sense of Urgency: How the Climate Crisis is Changing Rhetoric, with the University of Chicago Press. It informs her talk today, entitled Extinction Art, Climate Rhetoric, and the Work of Finding Presence. Please help me to welcome Professor Deborah Hawhee.
Thank you. Where's Tommy? Do I need to do anything with this? Okay, we're good? All right, thank you. Thank you, Professor Harold, for that introduction. Super generous. It's so nice to be here. I've been to Seattle before, but I've not ever been on campus, so this is really great, and I didn't realize how sunny it could be here. It's just gorgeous. So I want to thank especially Christine Harold, Leah Ceccarelli, Patricia Moy, and Tommy Ferguson for their roles in hosting, inviting, hosting, organizing, finding a date, which is often challenging. But it's nice that you're on quarter system, so we had lots of dates to choose from. So this talk is a little bit of an extension of, it extends from the book that Christine mentioned. And I'm moving, I'm planning to, it's sort of my contribution to a collaborative effort with Joshua Trey Barnett, who's my colleague in Communication Arts and Sciences, and who told me the other day that he was born in 1990. And I was like, what? Oh my God, I was in college. So anyway, we are having a great time with it, and I sort of want to acknowledge in advance his sort of influence on some of this work, and I'll cite him in the talk as well. So what does extinction look like? How does it sound? It's not exactly visible, nor is it noisy. The matter of species extinction exemplifies the innumerable challenges that the climate crisis poses for rhetoric. So I document some of those challenges in this book, but of course others in the humanities have already done so. Rob Nixon, Stacy Alaimo, Dipesh Chakrabarty. I could go on with a list of scholars who have done such documenting. The crisis is slow moving. The evidence is indirect, it's complex, it's often not visible. There's not, as Robert Cox and Phaedra Pezzullo put it in their textbook, Environmental Communication, There's not sufficient or sufficiently accessible visual evidence to help people grasp the magnitude of the crisis. These problems are well known. The climate crisis is all too often not near enough. It is not now enough. So it's tough to get people to feel and to care with numbers, statistics, and distant predictions. With species extinction, the rapidity and scale of which is a leading indicator of the climate crisis, it's hard to get people to see what's no longer there, to feel the implications. And so there are at least 3 good reasons to study extinction art from a rhetorical perspective. I should pause and say, Christine mentioned that I work on bodies. I also sweat a lot. And so today I went to the bookstore and I bought a towel because I was like, it's hot. And I'm just gonna lean into it. I'm an athlete, you know what I'm saying? So we're just gonna go with it. I love hot yoga too. So I actually like to sweat. Don't worry if I start sweating. It's not because somebody's freaking me out. I don't want to freak you out. Okay, there we go. The body aside. Okay, here we go. Where was I? First, I'm giving you the 3 reasons to study extinction art from a rhetorical perspective. First, the loss of species is one of the more difficult things to register. And this is true from a conservation science perspective, as well as a rhetorical perspective. Absence is as difficult to confirm as it is to convey. There's even this idea of dark extinction, and that's extinction that escapes notice altogether, either because it took place before humans began to keep records, or because the species existed outside of human realms. So a quotation I offer in my book from the investigative journalist George Monbiot, and the quotation is that the effects of climate change are easy to catalog but almost impossible to imagine. That quotation applies to extinct species. The losses themselves, their magnitude, can be difficult to comprehend. The rhetorical challenges of the climate crisis, in plain terms, comes down to the problems of accessibility, of palpability, and species extinction, that is the sharp decline of numbers and kinds of life, suffers from a different version of the same problem. How can we make accessible what is no longer there? So the geographer Catherine Yusof, writing about biodiversity loss more than a decade ago, points out that part of the challenge has been to make present those barely visible sites of life and death that characterize the extinction event. Indeed, meeting that challenge requires presence, and presence is something that theorists of rhetoric have been writing about for a long time. Presence, of course, is the state of being in the same place as a person or thing. And I was talking with the interpreters earlier, and the sign is something like this. Is that what you're, with presence? Yeah, what do you do? This one? There are a lot of different kinds, yeah. So, and I love this one especially. There are a lot of different options. I love this one because it's puts the thing in front of you. And that doesn't mean that what you're doing is wrong. Okay. So present tense in grammar means right now. The importance of presence to the rhetorical crisis that subtends and feeds the climate crisis led me to say in the book that present something like this. This is actually a paraphrase. I was like, let me find that quote. And it's there somewhere, but it's not exactly in these words. Presenting findings is not enough. We need to also work on finding presence. So this statement that we need to move from presenting findings to finding presence is, and I'm doing this for Leah, although, yeah, you'll see I got into this, okay, is of course a chiasmus, a rhetorical figure of transposition. It's an inversion. So this chiasmus of mine started as a kind of catchy and even memorable figure of speech, and it performs that characteristic crossing that the figure names, flipping the emphasis from findings to presence. Okay, and so today I want to linger in that crossing, and I want to slow down just a little bit to examine climate art and extinction art in particular, paying a special attention to how it performs that shift from findings to presence. This one here. Okay, so doing so edges up to what Leah Ceccarelli in this book calls conceptual chiasmus. Conceptual chiasmus for Ceccarelli effectively opens up pathways, and they're crisscrossing pathways between two different disciplines or modes of knowledge production. And in the case of this book, two scientific disciplines. In the case of this talk, scientific data and art. Okay, So here's the X again. So right here in the crossing is where we can find the work of rhetoric. The move from presenting to finding is one, I think, from delivery to invention. But that new finding can cross right back again by lending new presence to findings. So I want to keep them close, right? In other words, science, I kind of think science sometimes needs art, and I'm going to make that case anyway. The move from findings getting presented to being made present can help draw and hold attention to those findings, to boost their comprehension, to help them stick. And that's the work of rhetoric. So here's my plan. In order to dwell with rhetoric's work in the cross from findings to presence, I want to first elaborate the idea of presence and say a bit more about why the visual and plastic arts can help theorize it. And indeed, why specifically I think the visual and plastic arts may be among the most potent means of finding presence. And it has to do with feeling and sensation. Then for the rest of the talk, I'll examine 2 series of Extinction artworks for how they manifest sensuous presence. You know, one would have been fine, but I really want to work with 2, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm going to cram a lot into this talk. And we can talk about how that works or doesn't. But I'm going to start by, I'm going to try to make them work together by beginning with a side-by-side consideration of the 2 series of artworks and the way they make present one particular bird species, and then move on to how both series work with time and memory before I conclude. Okay, so finding presence. One of the main sources for a theory of presence in rhetoric, of course, comes from Chaim Perelman and Lucia Ulbricht-Teideke's The New Rhetoric, which was published in 1966. There, they distinguish presence from plain existence. It is not enough indeed, they write, that a thing should exist for a person to feel its presence. So the statement that I excerpted here helps support my point that findings themselves are insufficient. And it also suggests something else, that feeling is vital to presence. So this sensuous work of presence is explicitly and frequently tagged by Perelman and Ulbricht-Teiteke with the phrase, the feeling of presence. I've included on this next slide images of a few different uses of that phrase. Once I noticed it, I was like, oh, it's everywhere. You know, this is why Google Books makes our lives so much easier. You can just kind of search on it. And so as I talk about in the book that we were just talking about, of mine, and elsewhere, the aesthetic and the sensuous feed rhetoric in a number of ways, including the attentional, the dispositional, and the imaginative. So Fedor Pizzullo, I'm not the first to talk about presence in this way. Fedor Pizzullo helpfully draws out the tangible and sensible dimensions of presence. And Michelle Kennerly, my colleague at Penn State, emphasizes the visual nature of the kinds of presence facilitated by rhetoric when she observes that rhetoric's work often consists of giving presence to the unseeable, that is something not yet or never capable of being seen, or to the unseen, which is something visible but ignored. So I'm including here on the slide a couple of other outtakes from work on presence in rhetoric, one by John Murphy. An auditor feels the argument, it almost seems to be in the room, and that's why I like this. Is it the right hand in front? Yeah, this sign from ASL for presence, because it brings the thing into the room. And Luisa Caron in another piece says presence is a felt quality, and that piece is from 1979. So people have been talking about this for a while. This felt quality of presence is absolutely crucial. To feel evidence is to begin to grasp the enormity of the evidence's implications, the magnitude of what is happening. Felt evidence weighs and sticks, as in a dense atmosphere when breathing becomes difficult. Felt evidence differs from a calculative, deliberative, rational process of weighing the evidence, even as it draws on evidential knowledge, mixing it with other forms of knowledge, especially indigenous knowledge, visceral knowledge, ethical knowledge. So the kind of presence I'm tracking here is felt, or it aims to be felt, and it is sensuous. It is, in these cases, material. So presence in rhetoric can therefore be conceived as the concept that brings something else to the fore. It draws forth and holds space. It provides a shimmer of intensity. It catches and fixes the roaming senses, even if momentarily. And art really helps to draw out these features of presence. So in other words, material and sensuous forms of presence are the most potent forms of climate rhetoric, or at least I suspect they are. We can talk about that. Because they combine the direct with the indirect, which is to say they work directly on the senses and through bodies while engaging information and data indirectly or obliquely. So material and sensuous means of finding presence serve what Casey Boyle calls rhetoric's oblique function. And this is an image of a recent publication of his in RSQ. For Boyle, the signature move of the oblique is to turn and proliferate angles of approach. The task of the oblique is to become more sensitive to and exercised in the multiple directions any given situation may offer, to engage, this is another quotation here, to engage in sideways means of knowing and elliptical ways of being and moving. So this oblique function is often exemplified by material and sensory modes of engagement. Boyle himself intimates a close relation between the oblique function and the visual, plastic, and cinematic arts through his selections of examples. They come from architectural design, filmmaking, and the citational ecology of this short piece of his is dominated by theorists of aesthetics. So what art's obliqueness makes room for is imaginative speculation. Even Perlman and Ulbricht's Titeca acknowledge that possibility, that need, in their discussion of presence when they say this: presence and efforts to increase the feelings of presence must hence not be confused with fidelity to reality. And I think this is where we get kind of interesting in terms of questions about the real, and the true, and all this stuff, which we can hash out in the Q&A perhaps. So art's infidelity to something like reality might well give it greater reserves for drawing connections, for emphasizing relations, for holding space, and these are reserves that scientific knowledge does not and cannot have. So findings, then presence. As I mentioned earlier, extinction is often conveyed through lists, through numbers, through rates. Extinction in general names an absence, usually a slow diminishment of numbers, and then a more rapid one, sometimes a barely perceptible one, except for the people who are keeping track. So species whose numbers are declining dramatically are therefore considered endangered or threatened. They usually get listed, like with this example. And this is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, a global organization. The national list in the US is kept with the Environmental Conservation Online System. And then when these listed species are no longer known to exist, or thought to no longer exist, they're effectively delisted, meaning they've become extinct. So those delistings sometimes make the news. And here's an example of a New York Times article that's reporting on a very recent delisting that happened in 2021. So the reporting itself can be construed as a way of finding presence, of making absence present. That's what journalism kind of exists to do in a way, to call attention to something. So this New York Times article, like any good science writing, translates the information into accessible language. It focuses on the implications of the updated list. It focuses on the findings. It even includes images that seek presence, like this one, of a specimen of the Maui nukupu, a Hawaiian bird on the most recent delisted list. But the artists whose work I'll discuss today linger with those kinds of images like this, and they find additional means of presence through the materials of their art, whether it's recycled cardboard and acrylic paint, whether it's carved walnut, anodized aluminum, or ABS filament, the kind of material that goes through a 3D printer. So how might we characterize what's going on in this act of finding additional means of presence? The word translation could be sufficient for what material arts are doing with the translations of information obtained through scientific methods. Translation is handy because it moves something from one place to another. Like in the New York Times article, I think that's a good example of translation. It moves to another moves ideas to another venue, or presents them for a different audience. So that's the word that's usually used to think about science writing, translation. But in the case of artworks that find presence from scientific data, I'm opting for a word that tilts a little more toward the material conversion of elements. And so what this art provides is more than a translation, I'd say. It's a transmutation. So shortly after the delisting I'm discussing here, the multimedia artist Andrea Bowers began work on a set of paintings that she named the Eco-Grief Extinction series. I came across several of these paintings in the series when I visited an exhibition at the Hayward Gallery in London's South Bank Centre entitled Dear Earth. Each of the paintings depicts figures that present as women with species or specimens of a bird removed from the endangered list in 2021. That's the same list that the New York Times reported on, or the same delisting, I mean. So for the next few slides, I'll put the listed name next to Bowers' paintings, because the move from one to another provides, I think, example after example of what I'm talking about when I talk about moving from presenting findings to finding presence. And so it helps to show the kind of transmutation that I think is vital to the arts of presence. Okay. So here's the Maui akepa, a honey creeper. And there's the artwork. I showed it a second ago. Okay, this is the Molokai creeper, which is another honey creeper. This one is native to the small island of Molokai in Hawaii. The Kauai u'u, the smallest species of honey eater, also found on the Hawaiian Islands. Okay, this is the, let's see, that was this one is the Maui nuku pu'u, a larger honey creeper. And this one is a more recent version of the Maui nuku pu'u. The plumage on this one, I believe, marks it as male. So then there is the ivory-billed woodpecker, which used to dwell in the swampy hardwood forests of the US mainland. And the Bachman's warbler, a migratory bird of the southeastern and midwestern United States that spent winters in Cuba. Oops, there's that one. That's my favorite. Okay, so the second series, I'm going to go to a totally other medium, and I know that can be, I mean, I'm doing it on purpose to kind of show that this is not just about painting, right? So we can talk about the different mediums if you like. I'd welcome that. The second series I'll talk about is a sculpture series, and it's called Tipping Point, Echoes of Extinction. So what you see on the screen here is a close-up photograph of sculptures in the series, and they're based on sound waveforms. Okay, so most everyone here is probably familiar with the image of a waveform, right? That image is becoming kind of ubiquitous today. This is the one from the iPhone to indicate a voice memo. And then language learning apps like Duolingo. And then this is SZA's recent album, Control. I know about this from my 14-year-old daughter. And she was like, I want that. She saw this slide. She was like, I want that. So the waveform serves as the basis for Tipping Point. The artist Elizabeth Turk took waveforms from recordings of calls of extinct birds held at Cornell University's ornithology lab. She then flipped them vertically and gave them a third dimension in the form of sculptures. So she calls these sculptures sound columns. And these sculptures are often displayed in clusters, like this one, that Turk calls sound forests. So here's a photo of 5 of the sculptures that are currently, and I think this is true for probably another week, they're currently installed at the Ammon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. And I was able to visit those in January. I was thinking it was going to be warm, but it wasn't. I was really mad, actually. But anyway, here are 3 that are part of the permanent collection at the Catalina Island Museum in California. And here are 3 more that are on an outdoor path at the Cheekwood Estates in Nashville, Tennessee. So these sound sculptures are made from, as you could probably tell just from the slides I showed, from a variety of materials and methods. The metal ones, I think it's pretty interesting, like these metal ones and the other aluminum ones that are painted, Turk had milled by a gun machinist. And she told me that I interviewed her, and she told me that she joked with the gun machinist that she was going to have him make so many sculptures that she would put his gun business out of business. So I don't think that's worked yet, but she's on it. Others like these two of the bush wren and the Carolina parakeet, she created using a 3D printer. And so I mentioned that material earlier. It's made of these are made of ABS filament. And the first sound forest, let me go back. The first sound forest was installed at the Catalina Island Museum in California. And the individual sculptures included motion-activated sound recordings so that the forest was alive with the sounds that the columns rematerialize. But Turk also told me that the workers at the museum were like, these are driving us bananas. Like, you have to turn, because anytime anybody would walk by, like all these bird songs would erupt. So she had to move to QR codes on, and these are the ones on the placards at the Ammon Carter in Fort Worth. So I'm gonna also share a clip that the artist shared with me, and it shows kind of the principle of these sculptures. It's based on, I should mention that the Tipping Point also has success stories, so they're not all extinct birds. She has a whole bunch of extinct, and they're not just birds either, but I focus on the birds. But she has a whole group that are extinct birds, and then she has some that are still endangered and some that have made a comeback, right? And so this one is the bald eagle. And that bird, you probably know, was removed from the endangered list, but for positive reasons, after the chemical DDT was banned in the 1970s. So here's a clip. This is a sound clip, and it plays just to describe it, especially for Stephanie's sake, plays the call of the bald eagle. Let's see if we can get it to work. Okay, so now that I've given you a sense of these series of extinction artworks, oh, I didn't mean to do that. We'll give you another sense of it. That's awesome. Here we go. I'll return to the question of extinction art and presence. And to do so, it's helpful to look at both series together, and I'm going to do that for the next part of the talk. And the way to make it manageable, I decided, was to focus in on one species that actually gets kind of depicted in both series, and that's the ivory-billed woodpecker. So here are the two versions of the ivory-billed woodpecker. Both artists take informational data, a name on a list, a sound imprint, and they use the materials of their art to emphasize certain qualities of the species. So in the painting on the left, I'll just show that one by itself. The transmutation finds presence by placing a bird specimen and a human figure into aesthetic relation. Those relations are modulated by scale, by disposition, and by color. And Bowers uses scale to enlarge the bird and visually equalize the relation between it and the human figure. I think the artist, Andrea Bowers, calls it right-sizing. This change of scale is exactly the kind of departure from reality that art can enable. Okay, Bowers also uses shared disposition in her paintings, especially in this one. The body of the ivory-billed woodpecker is configured as in an almost unnatural curve, draping in suspension above the woman who is herself curled or bent in a disposition of what seems like despair, and I have further proof for that later. But color relay is another way that Bowers creates avian-human relations. With this one, even if you view it from a distance, as I did when I walked into the gallery, you can sort of see the glossy blue-black of the feathers and the hair. They're definitely the same paint. And then there's like some little blue tips up on the above the wing that also carry down into the bottom portion of the hair here, and then the brown, like tufted crown of feathers is carried into the bottom of the hair, the tips of the hair at the bottom. So these are all kind of draping downward through the the painting. The curved positions of death and mourning import and possibly impart an overall mood that's underscored by the words that are readable only by approaching the work and leaning forward. Or if you're doing a presentation, by cropping and zooming. So here, each work in the series includes excerpts from poetry, actually, written by a healer named Dina Metzger. And those lines also give each work its title. So in this work in particular, the title has been shortened actually to What Must Be Done in Order to Heal. I mean, that's the title, and the words have been shortened to What Must Be Done in Order to Heal. So the words themselves bend between matter-of-fact description and possibly a question in this case. So in the longer version of this, I make kind of a big deal of the words, and if you all are curious about those, I have more slides, but the talk was a little bit unwieldy, so I had to cut those out. But I have lots of stuff on grammatical mood, which is something I'm obsessed with. And I'll just leave the words here as kind of a really important component in this particular series. Okay, so Turks, this is really dark. Oh, wow, that's kind of cool. It's hard to see. Okay, so Turks, ivory-billed woodpecker. Here, this one is shown in aluminum, powder-coated in burgundy. And as I mentioned, it's machine-made by a gun machinist. And she chose a gun machinist because of the precision that their kind of gun mills provide. So this sculpture transmutes the sonic waveform data, as I mentioned, which is itself a machinic translation, into material form that takes up space. The discs jut out, here's a better, more viewable image, and give a weighty shape to the sound imprint. The variable disc sizes are the rising and falling of sound. I'll turn it that way, actually, that helps. So these are the computer drawings Turk sent me. These are the drawings she bases the sculptures on. And I did want to mention that people who study acoustics call these sound wave disturbances attack and decay, which is a pretty compelling set of words. The rising sort of disruption of air molecules is called attack, and then as the sound dissipates, it's called the decay, and it goes down to the inaudible. Another useful term is a transient, which is a noun used in acoustics to designate the high amplitude burst that often occurs at the beginning of a sound, and it marks a kind of loud, sudden disturbance. The word transient here would apply to the big jump when the bird's call pierces the air. The word itself holds the kind of initial rise and fall of a waveform all at once. So it's kind of a good word to work with. And from there, sound wave vibrations are thought to be ever dissipating, even as they cross the line of no longer being audible by many human ears. So that idea can take on an eerie quality that I discussed briefly in chapter 5 of a sense of urgency in relation to a whole other artwork that I don't have time to talk about. The sound columns artist here, Turk, mentions that the quality of sound, that is that it's dissipated down to nothing, somehow, but yet it's somehow not altogether gone. She talks about how the air, and I love this is a quotation, holds the memory of every sound that is no longer there. And in that same piece, it's just like a little essay that's in the catalog for this exhibition. In that same piece, the artist talks about the columns as positive shapes arising from loss. So through the QR codes, as I mentioned, hearing visitors can opt for a multisensory experience of the bird calls. The relay here is between the sound and silence, which gives a somber new presence to absence. So I wanted to share the placard that accompanies the exhibit in Fort Worth that I visited. It actually invokes the sculpture's silence and invites visitors to break the silence of the sculptures by listening to the QR codes. So whereas a waveform moves horizontally, this one is obvious, but I think it's one of the more compelling features of this sculpture, of this art series. Whereas a waveform moves horizontally, the sculptures upend that movement, right? And they call it to a halt. This placard kind of frames the contrast that I'm talking about. In that way, when it says the shapes of the wave rises vertically like a totem rather than run horizontally like we might see on a screen. So the sculpture's transmutations arrest sound and exert their own material form. Here's a photo of the ivory-billed woodpecker that I took in Fort Worth. The waveforms turn vertically, and the discs of the transients now cast shadows on smaller discs. You can see it a little bit better there, where they cast the shadows. The sounds of ivory-billed woodpeckers used to reverberate in cypress swamps and mature bottomwood forests of what is now the southeastern United States, but they now exist only in the recorded space of playback or in sound files. In fact, allegedly only one sound file that the Macaulay librarian sent a digital copy to me. I thought, I'll just share the email, right? So this is like another transmission. So that's how this sound exists, and the whole ivory-billed woodpecker is a whole other story that is amazing, and we could talk about it. But Turk sculpture, in contrast, inhabit a space, and those sculptures depend on visitor movement around them to take them in. Okay, and the sculptures relay with their new sites in a way. So in Fort Worth, I sort of noticed how the layers, the layers of the city sort of layer with that sculpture in this particular view. You've got the sort of clouds, they sort of resolved into a horizontal formation themselves, but that was a little bit arbitrary. And then you've got the winter grass and the hardscaping down at the bottom. As I mentioned, it was cold in Fort Worth, and the discs were really cold to touch. One morning they collected beads of rain from the previous night. And I love the one in Nashville that I showed earlier that has little icicles hanging off of it. Off of them. On a sunny afternoon, the long shadows of the spindly sculptures in Fort Worth angled across the graveled garden. And in a gallery with dramatic lighting, and this is from a New York exhibition, the shadows almost become part of the installation. So sound waves in this kind of machine-hewn transmutation fill space with solid, durable materials. Okay. So these two transmutations of the ivory-billed woodpecker show aesthetic pathways to new presences in the context of extinction. Whereas Bowers finds presence through scalar, dispositional, and chromatic relations, relations that relay and refract from bird figure to human figure, Turk finds presence by positing a relation between machine-sculpted material and machine-graphed vibrational movements, or ghastly imprints of sound. Okay, one more section, and then I'll sort of wrap up in a little bit. The formal material shapings of all members of both series also rework time and memory. And to do so, they generate silence and mood, respectively. So in Turk's series, the work with time features a vertical turn, right? Waveforms, and she mentioned this in the quote, or Turk herself talks about this, and I shared some quotations earlier that indicates as much. So waveforms are basic graphs with an XY axis. And in essence, they plot amplitude across time, or something like the volume of vibrating particles that are displaced by the pressure a sound wave exerts as it moves through, or as it moves air. So generally, the greater the vertical variation, the louder or sharper the sound. I think we all kind of intuit this now. It's a handy graph, or it's a handy graphic form. So that's where you get those transients that I mentioned earlier, the sort of larger displacements. And then the horizontal axis is time. And as Turk puts it in one of the videos about the sculpture series, sound has a length. I thought that was really lovely to think about sound having a length. But that's time she's talking about. And the sculptures upend time, as I mentioned. They reorient it, they call it to a halt, and they hold it still. The disturbance of the air takes a form that is solid and inert. And the disturbance also gets arrested by this form. The arrest of sound's movement answers the question that Turk poses with and about her series: are we creating a silence? It offers that answer, though, obliquely, yet materially. So these sculptures upend time, they suspend sound physics, they materialize silence. And as such, Turk's extinction art introduces a new orientation to silence in the context of environmental communication. So most of the work on silence and rhetoric exists in dialectical tension with speech or voice, right? And here, you know, in a published piece, I would talk about Cheryl Glenn's work. I would talk about this weird old piece by R.L. Scott called Sound and Silence, or what is it called? I think it's Silence, Rhetoric and Silence. And it was in Western, I believe, in the 1960s, but it's weird, I have to tell you. Okay, but I don't have time to talk about them right now. So most of those pieces are about speaking and silence or voice and silence. But art pulls silence away from its contrast with human voice or speech and imagines an ecological silence, a creeping hush of the lively and diverse forms of life that once thrived on Earth. And ecological science carries forward the point made by Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, particularly the first installment in The New Yorker that featured as the first chapter in Silent Spring titled Fable for Tomorrow, A Fable for Tomorrow. And this is just my iPhone picture of that. Isn't that lovely? I like the materiality of these things, though. Okay, so I could say a lot more about the fable form, and I have in a couple other places. But for now, I'm just going to say this. I think Turk's sculptures might be read as material instantiations of the fable form, as described by Carson. So both of them speculate on the long dissipation that extinction is causing when it comes to bird vocalizations. And whether they appear in a set of 3 or 5, these sculptures, or whether they stand alone, Turk's sculptures materialize an ecological silence, or really a silencing. And they bring that silencing or that reorientation of time before eyes, before hands, before bodies. They invite visitors to move around and through the silencing. And the sculptures make that silencing present. They do it more obliquely than extinction lists and numbers. And they do it with a distinct kind of potency that pulls findings into presence. So temporally, Turk's sculptures combine the then of the waveform with the now of decay, and they hold both in suspension. Turk's upending of time depends on the durable materials of her art, on the turning of the familiar waveform. And Bowers' work, too, depends on graphic art's ability to call forth and alter previous images and to overlay them with rescaled images of birds. So here's what I mean by that. Several of the human figures in the Eco-Grief series are sourced from older linotypes of mourning and devastation. So this one, let's see, this one, which is the Bachman's Warbler, recasts figures from a section illustration drawn by Robert Anning Bell for a 1902 edition of Percy Bysshe Shelley's poetry. And the RA who works with me created this really cool fade. Watch. Another image credits a figure in a 1914 piece called La Guerra, The War, drawn by an Italian political illustrator. And that's that one. The ivory-billed woodpecker figure that we've been talking about so much repurposes an image of mourning from Arthur Joseph Gaskin's illustration of a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale called The Rose Elf from 1893. And there's that fade. So the mood of these works pulls from past scenes of death and lamentation. The images drawn from established forms of mourning are placed in relation to the ecological mourning and to the extinct species depicted alongside them. So my colleague, whom I mentioned earlier, Joshua Trey Barnett, has a whole book on mourning in the Anthropocene. And he also has this great essay on ecological moods, where he talks about Aldo Leopold's creation of specific moods, of wonder, enchantment, sympathy. And here, the idea of mood helps Barnett characterize orientation and reorientation as kind of pathways to action. or something like, the awareness necessary for action. And that kind of reorientation is operating, I think, in the artworks that I'm looking at as well, but in a less direct and possibly more potent way. We could talk about that. So with this image, let's see. Here's another image of Bowers's, which is titled, How You Treat Us is How You Treat the Earth. The figure in a floral dress is in a supine position, and the image of the bird presents what is known as the ventral view, which refers to the underside of an animal or plant. And the bird image, of course, is based on this one from a specimen collected in 1893, and it's just occurring to me that that's the exact date of one of Bowers's sources, but that's just a coincidence, but it's cool. And it's preserved at a biodiversity center in the Netherlands, in Leiden. But even more recent work that has a realist cast, Bowers paints this same specimen in a series called The Dead Silence of Extinction. So this is the Maui akepa, and here is the Bachman's warbler. And so I'll likely work on this series in an expansion on the silence work, since Bowers has the word silence in that title as well. So I'd love to, hear if you have anything to say about them in the Q&A. We can talk about them a little bit more. But in order to get to the Q&A, I'll go ahead and end the formal talk here and return to that kind of powerful tension that I started with, the sort of tension between direct and indirect engagement. So of all the relations brought together in these two series, time and mourning, human and more than human, in material forms, I think aesthetic modalities, as I mentioned, work directly with and through the senses, and they sort of ask bodies to move around, especially in the case of the sculptures. But the elements all work on a more oblique level or indirectly. So it's that tension between the indirect and the direct that I'm really interested in exploring here. The room between the findings of science and the speculative presencing of art that I think they help rhetoric to kind of bear more. So my point then isn't just that, this is material rhetoric, although it is, but rather this is how material aesthetic rhetoric can do its work, right? Like it can reorient, it can reshape, resize, disorient, and its transmutations work directly on and through the senses while more obliquely mixing temporalities and speculating on futures, refusing sometimes a direct message. Art's capacity to relay between the real of scientific knowledge and the not quite real, or even more than real, of art may well make climate art one of the most potent available means of finding presence. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Has agreed to field her own questions, but I'll keep an eye on the clock so that make sure that we stay on time.
Yeah.
Other questions?
This is my favorite part.
Hi, thank you so much.
Sure.
I'm so glad I came to this talk.
Oh, yay.
Wonderful. I loved it.
Thanks.
And I loved your slides too.
Thanks.
It was so fun. I was really struck. I'm so glad you included the entire email from that librarian, because it was the audio file for the Ivory Building.
Yeah, do you want me to go back to that slide or no?
Sure.
Yeah, I can.
I just caught at the end of that email that she said, please destroy this file.
Yes.
When you're finished using it.
Yeah, I haven't done that yet. Yeah. Wait, let me find
When I
out.
think about the inversion of presenting findings and finding presence, that resonates so much that when it's presentation of data, it's like proprietary.
Yes.
She has to control it, in spite of the fact that this is the only existing recording, I think you said, of this bird. Like, how strange that it has to be kind of stricken.
Yeah, no kidding.
Your presence when you're done with it.
Yeah,
And yet,
love that.
on the other hand, art is for everyone, and it's, in the public, and meant to be accessed.
Right.
So it's not really a question.
Yeah.
It's sparks are flying.
Yes. I'm really glad you picked up on that.
Why did you want to destroy it?
Right. I didn't write her back and ask her. I just thanked her. please destroy the file. And I also am like, what does it mean to destroy a digital file? Like, how do I actually do that? I can't blow up my computer. I think it just means like trash it. Yeah, trash it. But that sort of language, I think, is fascinating. Yeah, and then the credit line follows that, which I think you're right to read those things together, right? Yes, that, and then I didn't even use it in this talk, interestingly. Too bad. I think I was afraid to, actually. But, yeah, I mean, what to do with that? I do think that the story, one thing I'll mention is that the story of the ivory-billed woodpecker, there's a great book called Listening in the Field by a scholar whose name is totally escaping me at the moment, but he's from the Netherlands, and it tells the whole story of the tracking down of the ivory-billed woodpecker in the 1930s to kind of, when it was very endangered and known to be endangered, to sort of get this recording and to get pictures. And so there are these photographs that are also on the Cornell Lab of Ornithology site, photographs, really grainy 1930s photographs of two ivory-billed woodpeckers in a nest. And then some of you probably know about like when the ivory-billed woodpecker showed up on that list to be delisted. A huge controversy arose from that question of whether it's actually extinct, right? Like in 2021, I believe. People were just like, oh, no, I've seen this bird, right? So it actually did not get delisted. It didn't get delisted, even though everybody's pretty sure that it's extinct, but there was so much controversy that the organization that was about to take it off the list just decided, we're not gonna make that call yet. We'll just leave it endangered and come back to it maybe some other time. But so that's, I mean, it's a really rich controversy that I think people in Rhetoric should be writing about. Somebody in Science Technology Studies has a cool little article about it. I just went off. But anyway, yes. It's funny that it's so proprietary. I agree with you. Yeah, Christine.
I feel like this is also not super shaping into a question just yet.
Yeah, it's okay.
I'm struck by these and, you know, the ways that sound horizontally captured as a wave is sensible because of the silences and the sounds, right? Of how the bird call is distinguishable as it's, by the pattern of the silences and the sounds.
Right.
And it's obviously fleeting and all of that. And it's just so interesting to turn it vertically. And then, you had one that had ice formulating, which is only possible by making it stagnant, static, right? Or the dewdrops on, and then other ones were casting light and shadow, which is more ephemeral, but, so it's just it's just an interesting, I'm interested in the notion of, preservation, but in a way that obviously renders it totally different from. I don't know, I don't know what the question is, but I think it's such an interesting, turning it into this new thing by making it static.
Yeah, Leah has something to add to it, thanks.
It's not static, it's turned into something that is no longer ephemeral.
That's right.
Because it is made out of metal. And painted, and it's permanent.
Yeah, and the artist, Elizabeth Turk calls them memorials at one point, right? Which of course people in our field are like, wait, I sure was, but I haven't written yet about that stuff. But yes, exactly. The kind of need for durable materials. And Turk herself, her whole body, prior to this particular series, her whole body of work is in marble, which is kind of like a lot of times the sort of material of memorials. So I think there's something there too. Yeah, you want to add something to the ephemeral and the preservation? Yeah.
I was struck that it was all sort of what seemed to be like urban material, construction material.
Oh yeah, good point.
And a lot of the way we describe bird sounds as being associated with like nature, the discourse of nature, which is only tied to a recent sort of discourse of the 20th century, right? The idea of nature sound.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the other thing you reminded me though is how birds are also in urban spaces, right? Like, and I was talking about this with some folks at another institution who Joshua Trey Barnett and I, the reason we decided to collaborate is because we were both independently, unbeknownst to each other, working on extinction art and extinction art that had to deal with birds, right? He's working on a whole other set of sculptures, not these, but another set called the Lost Bird Project. It's a little more well known, but that sculpts bird figures. And so you reminded me of that too, because birds, we're trying to figure out, okay, why birds, they seem to be the sort of species that gets, I don't know, memorialized or rendered in these artistic ways the most, right? And I'm trying to think, John Zern at the University of Hawhee was talking to me about that, and he called birds the celebrities of extinction, which is a kind of funky way to think about it, but it connects to all the work on the celebritization of sort of climate advocacy and all that stuff that I think could be really rich to think about a species as a celebrity, right? So anyway, you took me in a whole different direction that you didn't mean to, but thank you. So I think the urban part is it's useful to think about as a juxtaposition, but also to think about how birds are in all of those spaces and then some. Yeah, lots of hands. Okay, I'm gonna go here, and then in the out.
So my question goes in a different direction. Does someone have a question?
Oh, does anybody want to follow up on that? Thank you. Anybody want to follow up on that? Maybe? You're like, well, yeah, maybe if I could just get in.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, go for
That would
it.
be a sneaky way of getting in the...
Yeah, exactly.
First, thank you.
Sure.
I teach a course actually on extinction, and I feel like I have to overhaul my syllabus after
cool.
all this kind of environmental humanities. It's a bit more literary. But I had a question. I was wondering if you could say more about, I guess, the term extinction and some kind of suspiciousness maybe around the term extinction as it might play into, as it might, I don't know, invoke other interpretations or considerations of these artworks. Thinking about, was there that volume that came out recently on contesting extinction?
Oh, yes, good.
This, which is a bit more right in terms of extinction as it's carried over into talk about cultural extinction, so language loss,
Yes.
and the ways
Yes.
in which that's
Yes.
really problematic, and this whole history of extinction being really cases of it being weaponized
Yes.
to as a natural historical event to legitimate very historical violence, and so
Yeah.
I'm thinking about where I want to raise this in terms of these artworks is that. Thinking about making, extinction present, and thinking about how extinction can call, as a term, can call attention to things but obfuscate things as well.
Oh yeah, good. Say
What
more.
You mentioned Hawaii.
Yeah.
And there's a whole, a colonial history
Yes, sure.
that is outside of the image in a way, or that is not conveyed there.
Absolutely.
Even though that seems to be part of the process of extinction. So, could you say more about that? Maybe rhetorical presence and absence in these works?
Yeah, one thing you're making me think of is, what's his name? Van Door, the scholar who writes about pathways.
Yeah.
What's that?
Tom Van Doren?
Yeah, Tom Van Doren. He has a really great, his book has a really great discussion of how extinction isn't quite the right word because whole life, and he's talking about birds in this case too, he's talking about how this sort of diminishment and dwindling of species alter their whole life forms, right? The flock sizes, and this has to do, and as I talk, I'm remembering some more of the book, but he talks about specific sites in, say, South Asia, and how sort of development and exactly the kinds of processes you're talking about, like colonization and all this stuff, have encroached on the habitats in a way that have altered the life ways of these birds even before something like extinction or even endangerment happens, or as it happens. You know what I mean? So he's problematizing it from that perspective, which I think entails that wider view that you're asking for. Yeah, and I think art does, yes, okay, arts of presence absolutely emphasize certain features of the species, the kinds of the kinds of features that I think will draw people, will draw people in and that kind of thing. But it absolutely obfuscates. I mean, there's not even a background on it's recycled cardboard, which tells you something a little bit about like it may have another oblique message here, but absolutely selecting out. And to fault it for that, I think that's just how arts of presence work, right? But I think it is, something we should ask, right? Like what's being absented through these arts.
The sound column, when you mentioned how the manufacturing process and that it was, like a machinist who manufactures guns, like that was a kind of interesting moment where there is a more a broader view and it's not so drawn tightly. Yeah. Where you can see the larger kind of ecology of extinction.
Yes, and that you're helping me remember one other point that I'll mention from Van Door's book about the problem of, he talks about about the obsession, I think it's him, he talks about the obsession with specimens over species, right? So like, the stories, I see you nodding, the stories of the sort of the last member, the endling, I think they're called, which is kind of poetic in and of itself. The last, it's called the last member of a species. Thank you. I'll finish my sentence. I need you around. The last member of a species, and it's called endling, right? Endling, endling with an L. Yeah. But he critiques that, because that's a kind of individualized. And I sort of thought, this art is, I think, subject to that criticism because it's a very much of a specimen-driven art. You can even tell she bases some of the art on actual specimens. So the wider view of the species and the group and all that stuff, I think we're losing as well. That's a really long answer to your question, which,
thank you.
It's all these questions are so rich. Thank you. All right, you in the middle and then on the outside. Thanks.
Yeah, you mentioned the artworks as being less direct, but possibly more potent than other approaches like this. Wondering if you can share a little bit more about how you've been exploring that sense of comparison with potency in terms of effects, impacts, when it comes to the art.
Right. That's always the question, isn't it? The effects, right? I think this is where, Robert Harriman and I had a really good exchange about this because I think he grapples with this too as somebody who looks at aesthetic forms and is content to do a kind of criticism and critical analysis and leave maybe to the side, or have that stand in for an effects, right, reading. I think he and Harriman have a piece in that collection on rhetoric and effects that is quite good on the score. And I'm forgetting the main points, but it's very good. And let me think. One of the things that Elizabeth Turk is doing, this artist, the one who does the sculptures, is participatory art. So she has, and the first sort of iteration of the sculpture series had some kind of scripted involvement where people come in and participate. And then she sort of talks to people afterwards, and so she's doing her own almost polling in a way, and to see, because her hunch, and I love this hunch, and I think that maybe some of our colleagues in the social scientific part of communication could study this a little more, or maybe we could too. What she's trying to see is, or what she's trying to test is kind of whether she thinks it's better to have a kind of bodily experience with an art and then have a conversation and deliberate about the kinds of possible messages there. She says, and I think this is so fascinating in terms of rhetoric, she withholds the message deliberately, right? So that's what another sort of, and again, what I don't want to say is, so what she says goes. It's just a really, really fascinating approach to trying to engage folks, right? And so one of the things I do in the book is think about, okay, what can we learn from all the attempts at engagement, right? And that's often where my work goes, and then I'll sort of think about, okay, what that means for theory. But, whether this can make a difference for extinction, I think remains to be seen. And Leah's like, I don't know. How do you answer that? Why are we paying you to be here? But great question. I welcome more thoughts on on that question too. Is yours? You want to jump in here?
Well, it was actually, I had part of that same question.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move a little bit beyond it to, because one of the things that in my own work, and particularly I think about what art can do to interrupt and delay uptakes within really complicated, intransigent sort of conflicts.
Yeah.
And my thinking is Israel-Palestine is really one of those.
Sure.
And so one of the things that I remember is what can art do that would delay sound bites and linger. And I remember a moment when I was at the Tate Museum in London, and there was this very large installation, I think maybe the size of that wall, called Sabra and Shatila, and it was an abstract depiction of the massacre in the Palestinian camp in Lebanon. And what was so interesting to me, I just sat there for hours watching what people would do as they walked by. And it's long enough that you would sort of be walking by it for a little bit of time. And started thinking about just the way of measuring presence by the amount of time somebody stayed in the presence of this work of art, which if it was depicted in other forms, would cause reactions and would have a particular view that would make them interfere with just how they were going to engage. Right? So I was thinking about whether that's, so I love what you're saying about the means of presence, which substitutes for the means of persuasion, but then because of how do we measure the impact of presence? Right. And so it's somewhat sort of a similar question, but would it be just in terms of the amount of time spent in front of?
Could be.
And you had the one example of the artwork where the person leaned in.
Yes, that was me. But yeah, sure, other people were too, right? Because the words were so small, like it's inviting that, and that's where the formal reading can sometimes. Anyway,
But can we sort of get at presence to the bodily, the bodily engagement reaction to this? That would precede then the conversation that follows.
I mean, that's what I did a little bit in the book. So I have a chapter on an art installation by Maya Lin in Madison Square Park. She sort of had dying trees brought in from the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. And I don't know if anybody knows about this art installation called Ghost Forest. But it took up a huge chunk of Madison Square Park. And so when I went there to study it and write about it, I just kind of watched how people moved. Right, and it was right at the end of, can we say the end of COVID? I mean, my niece has it right now, no. But this sort of, it opened in May of 2021, right? So people were, in New York, were still wearing masks outside a little bit, but the joggers would like come up and their masks would be kind of hanging off their face and they would just like stop and look around for the written material, right? And then go. And so that happened a lot. This one woman came up, I talk about this in the book a little bit, but this one woman came up, she was on her way to a meeting and she goes, I'm in a hurry, are these real? and then the security guard goes, no, they're fake. And I was like, no, they're not fake. I was just like, am I now participating? What's happening here? So that kind of research, which I had like a qualitative methods class in grad school, but I'm not like super qualified to do it, but this kind of, and I mean, I did get some IRB approval to go and all that stuff, but the ambient sort of observation, I think, is one way. Some of these, I mean, Turk has made, she keeps having more versions of the same sculptures made in different materials, and they're going everywhere, so it would be almost impossible to like go see, but I like to watch how people interact, and there are people who write about sculpture and how it invites. And I was kind of drawing on that without citing it, but invites people to move around it, like sculpture in the round, and that's, I think, the case here, just to sort of get all the angles. So there is a kind of bodily commentary to go with, but I appreciate that feedback too. And then you, and then, yes.
Yeah, I guess my question is, well, first of all, thank you so much.
Sure, of course.
My question kind of dovetails with Denise's in thinking about sorts of the scale and the scope of the audiences that these artworks call into presence. I'm just thinking that like art is a global market, and that these pieces travel. It seems internationally, but they're also, and so for a moment they're local, but they're calling attention to a global issue. And I think, by contrast, it makes me think of these. There's this Danish environmental artist, Thomas Dambo, who has created 6 like 20-foot tall trolls in these.
I've seen that.
Forest place. There's 6 in the Seattle area.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's interesting because those
that's so cool.
invite a different kind of presence, a certain reverence, and there's a real like site specificity to them.
Yes.
So there's something you said about the material aesthetic rhetoric can kind of reshape and resize someone's relationship to the built world. So I'm curious your thoughts on the audiences that these artworks are calling them.
Yeah, I mean, so right. Now let me just because when I talked about, was it this stuff? No, I was talking about the myelin work at Northwestern about a year ago, and people were asking, and their question was coming from a similar question, but their question was coming from almost a kind of suspicion of a kind of elitist, right? Like artwork is kind of an elitist thing, and one of the things I said about that particular artwork was that it was public art in the middle of a really populous city. And so it was maybe trying to reach a broader audience than sort of something that's in a museum that you pay admission for, or that nobody cares to go into, or something like that, or only maybe highly educated folks. I don't want to generalize too much, but still. Is that where you're coming from? Sorry, I'm just checking.
I don't quite have that suspicion. I mean, I'm sort of curious about the global local, like Extinction being a global issue, being felt locally, and then also that this art too seems like it's pulling species from not the local space.
That's right.
But so it's just calling attention to this global.
Right. Yeah, and pulling. I mean, I think Bowers. Honestly, I haven't talked to Bowers yet, but I kind of want to get an interview with her because my hunch is that she read that New York Times piece, because every single species listed in that Times, bird species listed in that talk or in that article, shows up in her paintings. So I was like, whoa, this has to be some sort of, and she did the paintings she started them about a month after that. And I'm not saying she read the New York Times per se, but I think maybe she encountered that information, which was circulating really broadly. So I think your question is also one of circulation, isn't it? And it's about sort of artworks that can move around, ones that are designed to stay put in one place. So the sculpture series that Joshua Trey Barnett is working on is multiple sculptures of 5 different bird species that are extinct. And now every time I use the word extinct, I'm going to think about you and think of like, okay, let's talk about what other, but seriously. And so each one has its kind of point of, I don't know, origin or something like that. So the great auk, I think I want to say that it's whatever point of origin is in Vancouver, not point of origin, but like the place where that sculpture is permanently installed. And then there are traveling ones that go all around. There's like a whole set of them at Stanford University's campus right now. It's like we're tracking them everywhere. And so, but the artist placed the permanent ones at the places that were significant for either the demise of that bird species or the sort of life, the sort of like thriving of the bird species. So that I think gets at the site-specific nature of what you're talking about, but then there's the whole set that just like travel around because he made them from molds,
Which is just, part of the global economy.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And of course you can buy them, right? I mean, I will never, but I think Penn State bought one for its aviary. There's a really well-endowed aviary, and by endowed I mean supported by donors. Aviary there, and there's I'm trying to remember which one. I think it's maybe the passenger pigeon, one of those things. I'm looking at you now because you were connecting to the sort of Martha story, the last passenger pigeon, who had a name. Anyway, yes. So yeah, people can commission those and install them. Anyhow, I like that as an example of what you're talking about, and I think I'll get your name too, because I think all of these questions are going to show up in whatever work Joshua and I Publishing. Okay, wait a minute. Did we get everybody else? Let's see. I think you had a question, and then Tommy, and then you. No, you were simultaneous almost. Okay. So why don't you go ahead?
All right.
Please.
So some of what I was going to ask, Jennifer asked, and you responded. Because you started with the idea of presence and here and now.
Yes.
Like the absence of presence.
Yeah.
Can you say that?
Yeah, sure.
Renders sort of the climate crisis invisible or too far in the future. So would you say that the materiality of these sculptures embodies sort of the presence that we need to be sensitive to species that have been extinct? And if so, do we, the people, actually know what these sculptures mean?
Right.
Come across them in footwork?
Right.
Do we know what?
Right.
That's the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so 2 ways to think about this. One is, to answer the last part of the question, what I'm trying to do with the indirect part of things is think about art's, indeterminacy, like the sort of, there's not one, meaning that I think we can ascribe. So that's one part of the potency, maybe, of art. The other thing I want to say to the first part of your question is that I don't know if this is what you're thinking I said, but I don't know that art is the solution. I think it's like one of many. We need all hands on deck. All hands on deck is basically my point here. And the artists have a lot to teach us, I think, about ways of pulling things in and materializing certain aspects of loss and those sorts of things. So I'm sort of looking for rhetorical lessons or outtakes, right? Like even those of us who can't make art could think about how to do in other ways, with words, with other means. So that's another. You helped me sort of remember another sort of purpose behind this approach, right? Sure, that helps, Tommy, and then over here.
Sure. So I'm no scholar. I'm more of an artist. So
cool.
Coming from maybe a different lens here. And apologies if you already covered this in the very beginning. I had to step out. But as I'm looking at this, I'm kind of taken back in like the way that it's flipped downwards instead of upwards. I'm curious if the artist had an intent with that, because I see it like from my perspective, it's like there's a definitive ending with the ground, and it kind of reads into that despair that you were talking about in some of the other art that you showed.
I love that point.
So I'm just curious if you had any perspective on what the artist had intended with the piece. So.
Yeah, I love that point. I mean, I think I'm constantly getting confused looking at these sculptures about which way is up and down, but you're right about this one.
Yeah.
That the sort of this one has such a distinct sort of what's it called? The attack, that you can tell which way it's going. Yeah. But she talks about them as reaching skyward, which then confuses me. But
right.
So yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, I think thinking of them as almost grave markers or something like that, might be one way to go with that insight. Sure. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I could see the ethereal nature of upward versus, the finality of down.
Right.
So.
Yeah, it's much harder to tell with some of the other ones. This one's harder to see because it's all white, but it's harder to tell where the attacks are in relation to the top and the bottom on that one. Is that what you were asking me to look at? Other ones? Like yeah. Well, in the original, not the original, but the first slides that I shared, hang on, with the drawings, or even my title slide, those are her computer drawings of. So the ivory-billed woodpecker is pretty distinct, actually, from, and I need to recognize that as if I give this talk again. So because the other ones have less of a distinguishable bottom and top.
Yeah.
But I love that insight. Thank you. Good. Let's see. another question?
Hi.
Yeah.
Thank you for amazing
Oh,
presentations and I'm also coming from non-scholarly background and the arts.
Great.
Work with the artists. My questions are actually quite simple, but just wanted to ask you what informed you and shaped you to narrow down the list of artists and many environmental artists out there, or Extinction out there, and whether the choice of artists and materials artists has chosen is kind of a core of your choices.
Yeah.
And whether you, however, represents the works of Dane Mitchell, and he's a New Zealand artist, and he is presenting New Zealand to the Wednesday environment. His whole thing was about extinct species. And
Okay.
what are the names of species? With a sound that was just presented throughout the island.
Oh, wow.
So
Yeah.
there's
Nice.
melody and naming other. So there's a wave sound wave you mentioned that was
Yeah.
interesting.
Nice. And could you spell that artist's name for me?
Yeah, Dane Mitchell.
Uh-huh.
D-A-N-E.
Yeah.
N-I-T-H-E-L-L.
Great. Awesome. New Zealand.
22 or 21. There was New Zealand.
Great. Yeah.
Sorry, last question. Yet simple, but I have to ask whether artists ever mentioned about creating the space for grief or mourning.
Oh, yeah.
And how that informs the audience. So I'm thinking, based on like mental art, environmental art, and extinction art, and now we're like living through the moment where the climate crisis and disasters are the norm.
Yes.
Almost, just more thing to say, but whether, engaging in a sense of grief, or you mentioned towards your end of the lecture about hope, whether that's something that you think about as a researcher. I know it's not touchy on talk about hope, but how artists are thinking about the space of art engaging in grief also. I know it's like a really broad question.
Oh yeah, no, it's an important one. So a bunch of different things occurred to me. One is my collaborator Joshua Trey Barnett writes about grief and mourning, and his work on the sculptures that I talked about, the Lost Bird Project, I think started there because that artist, and there's a book and a documentary about that work, talks about those sculptures as occasions for mourning and grief. And they have like a reflective surface almost, like a really dark, almost silhouette. And so we're sort of thinking about that in relation to feelings of grief and self-reflection and all that stuff. And so I kind of leave that to Joshua because he wrote about grief, but I shouldn't. That's, we should both talk about it. Hope comes up when it came up in the interview I did with Elizabeth Turk, the sculptor, and because she talked about that, how that's her reason for including success stories like the bald eagle, because she's like, how could I even do this work if there weren't some hope, right? So that's her hope. Whether she's trying to like inspire hope or something like that, I think she pulls back from going that far. But I think there's space for the whole range of feeling, and that's hard to track and document for sure. But I would say they're circulating kind of around both of these works. But to go back to your first question, I thought about. I'm trying to remember the name of the Icelandic / Danish artist who is really well known, and I'm just blanking on his name. But what's that? Yes, Eliasson. Yeah, thank you. It's the last name is Eliasson, Elisson. And I think it's Oder or something, and so he had who talked about the Tate Modern. So he had a bunch of stuff at the Tate Modern, all climate art. He brought ice from glaciers and had it melt in front of people, this kind of thing. So that seems to me a really good example of arts of presence. Why these? Honestly, I was in London. I was there to study something unrelated to environmental art, and I just happened to go to this. I was like, I was going to go to see a play at Shakespeare's Globe, and this gallery was nearby, and I walked in and saw these paintings, and I was like, holy shit, I need to write about these. So it was much more of an encounter, of a kind of opportunity and an encounter. Now, when I saw. I just saw some sort of notice about these sculptures, and I thought, oh, that would be a really cool, different, interesting sort of art to put next to this other. But I'm keeping track of other artists, and I know Extinction art is kind of exploding right now. Like, it's a weird way to talk about it, but yeah. So thank you, and it's almost random right now. Okay, it's 5 o'clock. Should I? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.